Having served with the Gordon Highlanders in Berlin between 1949 and 1952, Ron has always been keen to make a return visit to see the city. As regular visitors to Berlin, Leanne and I were only too happy to invite Ron and Pat to come and join us just after we had completed the Berlin Half Marathon in early April 2012. What you're about to see is some film and photos from this visit.
It was great to welcome Pat and Ron to Berlin as they arrived at Tegel Airport. So now all their careful planning for their trip to Berlin could be well and truly put into action.
As part of Ron's duties when serving in Berlin, he often had to show the flag when patrolling the British-Russian border. And it didn't take him too long to do some showing off that flag when arriving at the airport. Having arrived late afternoon yesterday, today was a chance to introduce Ron and Pat to the main sights of central Berlin, just to let them get their bearings.
The Reichstag is the German Parliament building, which was first built in 1894 and it took 23 years to complete. The building was destroyed by a fire in February 1933 and the event proved pivotal in the development of Nazi power with the immediate introduction of the Reichstag Fire Decree, which seriously restricted civil liberties. This was of course instigated by Hitler, who had become Chancellor just a few weeks before the fire. The Parliament was reconstructed during the Cold War period, but due to its proximity to the border between East and West Berlin, it was used very rarely for formal meetings and events. Throughout this time, the Parliament for West Germany sat in Bonn. Shortly after reunification, there were calls made to bring the German Parliament back to Berlin. Then in 1991, the Parliament returned to the Reichstag. Although it was seen as controversial at the time, Berlin is now accepted amongst all Germans as being the political capital.
The iconic words Dem deutschen Volke, meaning to the German people, were carved above the main facade of the Reichstag building in 1916. This was much to the displeasure of Wilhelm II, who had tried to block the adding of the inscription due to the democratic significance of the words. This image was taken in 1947 and shows the destruction caused by the fire and the war. Ron did recognise the Reichstag building on first sight during our trip, but it was certainly different to when he had seen it back in 1949.
This monument is known as the Siegessäule, or the Victory Column, and marks Prussian victories over Denmark, Austria and France during the late 1800s. Berliners call this statue Goldelse, meaning Golden Lizzie. The Victory Column originally stood in front of the Reichstag building, but was moved to its current location about half a mile directly behind the Brandenburg Gate, under Hitler's plans to redesign Berlin into Germania. The moving of the monument helped in its survival, as its original location in front of the Reichstag area was heavily bombed during the American air raids in 1945. Following the war, the French wanted to destroy the monument, however Britain and America vetoed their plans.
This is the Soviet War Memorial in the Tiergarten just behind the Brandenburg Gate. It was erected in 1945, just a few months after the capture of the city. The memorial marks the death of some 2,500 Russian soldiers during the Battle of Berlin. The memorial is in the former British sector of Berlin, and its construction was supported by all the Allies. Throughout the Cold War, Soviet guards were present at the memorial, sent out and changed regularly by the Soviet occupying forces in the Soviet sector.
The most iconic image in Berlin, the Brandenburg Gate. The gate was one of 18 customs gates built in the 1730s around the fortified city and its suburbs. The design is influenced by the Propylaea, which is the entrance to the Acropolis in Athens. Ironic then that the most famous structure in Berlin today was influenced by Greece, considering the current economic climate in Europe. The structure on top of the gate is known as the Quadriga and was taken to Paris in 1806, following Napoleon's victory over the Prussian army. However, it was returned to Berlin in 1814, following the Prussian victory and occupation of Paris. This victory was marked by adding the Iron Cross being held by Victoria.
The gate was a prominent checkpoint when the city was split between East and West during the Cold War period. This view is from the former Russian eastern side, therefore it is not a view Ron would have been able to have when serving here. And so, here is Ron doing something today that he couldn't do back in 1949 to 1952. That is, walk through the Brandenburg Gate. Ron reckons if he was to do this back then, he may have been shot on sight, or at the very least arrested by the Russians. The gate is now seen as a symbol of freedom following the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War in the late 1980s and early 1990s. This picture was actually on the wall in our apartment, and it shows the Brandenburg Gate in the 1960s, when effectively it served as part of the Berlin Wall.
This is Neptune Fountain, built in 1891 and located in the heart of the east of Berlin, near Alexanderplatz, directly under the TV tower. It's often overlooked by tourists and is now frequented by the anarchists who have been moved on from Alexanderplatz as it has become more commercial and westernised.
This is Berlin Cathedral. A feature of the growing tourism in central Berlin has been the attraction of children begging, as Ron found out when we were filming here.
Piss off, man.
Deutsch.
The cathedral is known locally as Berliner Dom and was built in the 1450s. Officially, it is not a cathedral, as there has never been a sitting bishop in the Berliner Dom. The cathedral is now a tourist attraction with a €7 entry fee. It regularly hosts carol singing concerts, with pipe organ playing being another key attraction.
The last of our things to see today, this is Gendarmenmarkt, which is a square that houses two identical churches, one French and one German. These are separated by a beautiful opera house.
This was the day Ron had been waiting for, the return to his former barracks in Kladau.
This is Wannsee, where we took a ferry over to Kladau en route to Ron's barracks. Kladau is a suburb to the northwest of Berlin and is around 20 kilometres from the city centre. To get there from our apartment involved an underground train, an overground train, and finally this ferry trip. It was hard to believe that all this transport was included in our travel pass, which only cost €33 for the whole week.
There really was a feeling of excitement and anticipation amongst us all as we crossed the water to Kladau. Although Leanne and I had been to Berlin lots of times, this felt very different. It was as if we were walking through history with Ron, all the way back 60 years. Ron, welcome back to Claddagh.
This is the barracks at Claddagh, from where we guarded supplies brought into Gatow Airport during the Berlin airlift by the RAF, from where we also guarded Rudolf Hess at Spandau prison.
There was a soldier, a Scottish soldier, who wandered far away.
Michael had contacted the Ministry of Defence to arrange a tour of the barracks, and on arrival we met Herr Bloch, who was our guide for the day. The barracks were known as Montgomery Barracks when Ron served here, and this remained the case until 1993, when they were handed over by the British to the German Army and are now known as Blücher Barracks.
This is the block where Ron slept when staying at Montgomery Barracks. His room was the one in the top right hand corner. These are 3 oak trees which were planted during royal visits to the barracks by the Queen, Prince Charles and Princess Anne. Each tree marks each of the British regiments who have been based at the barracks whilst serving in Berlin. Of course, there are the Gordon Highlanders, along with the Black Watch and the Welsh Fusiliers. Ron thought it was a bit ironic that the oak trees that were planted were American oak trees. "They bloody get everywhere, those Americans," was the direct quote from Ron. After our tour of the barracks, Herr Bloch took us to the site of Spandau Prison, which was demolished and the rubble buried in a secret location within 24 hours of Hess dying. The German authorities were concerned that if anything was left intact, it could become a focal point for the far right to adopt as a shrine. This is Reichskanzlerplatz and the location of Ron's NAAFI. So I believe a lot of Ron's leisure time was spent here when he was off duty, not to mention a few brawls with the Welsh Fusiliers, which I'm sure Ron will be able to tell you all about. As well as being a strategic location for Ron on the weekends, Reichskanzlerplatz has a symbolic and significant history. In 1933, Hitler renamed it none other than Adolf Hitler Platz. He then drew plans of a monument for Mussolini, with a view to renaming it Mussolini Platz. However, these plans never came to fruition, and it reverted back to its former name of Reichskanzlerplatz following the war, which is what Ron knew it as and frequented it by. This flame and monument was placed in the former Reichskanzlerplatz in 1955. The emblem Freiheit, Recht, Friede translates as freedom, justice, peace. On the back of the emblem it says, "This flame will burn until the restoration of German unity and the realisation of the right to a homeland." And I suppose that what this monument shows is the eagerness amongst Western Berliners to have the whole of Germany reunited from as early as 1955. This is the Olympiastadion, or Olympic Stadium. Ron was keen to visit the stadium as he was often based here when on R&R. Ron can recall spending time here swimming and doing other sports when he was based here. None of the outlying buildings brought back memories for Ron, therefore he thinks the swimming pool and gymnasium may have been under the stadium. and his sleeping quarters may have been within the stadium grounds too. The stadium is of course steeped in history from the 1936 Olympics, with Jesse Owens winning gold in front of Hitler. The stadium remained intact during the war, so the architecture hasn't changed. It currently acts as the home football ground for Hertha Berlin, one of the two football teams in Berlin. This is Ron standing outside the stadium, roughly in the area where he had his photo taken with the rest of the Gordon Highlanders and C Company back in 1949. And here is that old photograph. Now then, here's a teaser. Can anyone spot Ron when he was in his late teens?
Because those green hills are not Highland.
After 2 days of busy sightseeing, today was about taking it easy and recovering. The weather turned very cold too, which kept us from doing too much outside. This is Alexanderplatz, one of the areas of Berlin that has changed so dramatically since the wall came down. It was once a significant landmark for East Berliners, so popular that it was referred to as simply Alex, but is now said to be the centre of unified Berlin. Once its TV tower and world clock provided great meeting places for anarchists and punks, but today it hosts many large stores and an Easter market which we visited. At the Easter market was this lovely windmill, which was also a cosy wee cafe. Here Ron enjoyed sampling another delicious German dark beer and the obligatory bratwurst. We were so keen to get inside away from the cold that we were even attracted to this ice cream parlour in Alexanderplatz station. The ice cream was delicious, but we must have been mad.
Don't worry, there is no need to adjust the TV set. This is not a snowy picture, it's a snowy view. It had certainly been cold enough to snow all day, and luckily it held off until we got back to our cosy apartment. This was the view from our window, so we were thankful that we had bought all our supplies at the market, so we just stayed in and had snackies.
Believe it or not, this is the same place. This is a view from our apartment onto Strausberger Platz, which means square, but as you can see, it's really a roundabout. The wedding cake style towers here at the Platz marks the beginning of Karl Marx Alley, a monumental boulevard built by the socialist GDR government between 1952 and 1960. During Ron's time in Berlin, however, the street was actually called Stalin Alley, and the apartments were a flagship project of East Germany's reconstruction programme after World War II. The aim was to create luxurious living space for the ordinary workers, including amenities like cafes and shops. The boulevard is about 2 kilometres long and the apartments are 8-storey high, with the outside beautifully decorated in ceramic tiles. The street was used for East Germany's annual May Day parades, with thousands of soldiers and tanks showcasing the power of the communist government. As Berlin sits on 2 rivers, then a boat trip was essential, so we took an early boarding on this fine Sunday morning. The trip took us through many of the outlying eastern districts, including Köpenick with its beautiful town hall and quaint architecture. This is one of Berlin's first breweries, Berliner Burger Brauhaus, which is now a very popular restaurant. So we thought if you can't beat them, join them, and popped in for a wee drink. We enjoyed plenty refreshments too as we sailed along. This appeals to Ron, a floating shed. The boat trip was a lovely and peaceful way to see Berlin from a different perspective. It gave us a great chance to get away from the hustle and bustle of the city. The people of Berlin love spending their spare time outdoors in the blue or green spaces around the city, and we were able to see why.
This is the other and more grand Soviet memorial monument in Treptower Park. This particular statue is the epic Mother Russia, grieving for her dead children. She looks onto two mighty walls which are understood to have been built using marble scavenged by the Soviets from Hitler's ruined chancellery. Beyond lies a massive plaza lined with 16 sculpted pictures representing the then 16 Soviet republics, each decorated with war scenes and quotes from Stalin. The monument then culminates in a mausoleum topped by a 13-metre high statue of a Russian soldier clutching a child he saved during the battle for Berlin. And of course his sword is resting on a shattered swastika to mark the Russian victory over fascism. Stalin ordered the building of the monument in 1949, and it was built on the graves of 5,000 Soviet soldiers killed in the Battle of Berlin. The monument attests both to the immensity of the wartime losses and the overblown self-importance of the Stalinist state. Very bold, very symbolic, very Soviet.
A special treat for all our visitors to Berlin has to be breakfast in the restaurant of the Parliament building, the Reichstag. Ron and Michael opted for the Bavarian breakfast, including a mandatory wheat beer. But Pat went for the Reichstag special. The beauty of having breakfast at the Parliament is you can then gain direct access to the dome of the Reichstag building. The amazing structure of glass and mirrors was designed by British architect Sir Norman Foster, with a symbolic intention to shine light onto the Parliament whilst allowing the German people to keep an eye on their politicians. The Dome is also a major visitor attraction and gives panoramic views of the city which are enjoyed by millions of tourists every year. So we were able to burn off some of our lovely breakfast by making our way up the ramp through the dome structure. This gave us a bird's eye view of all the places we had been to and seen during our trip in Berlin. We were able to see all the way over to Ron's NAFE and barracks in the west, beyond the Victory Column, while still seeing the unmistakable TV tower and our apartments to the east. From here, you could really appreciate the amount of ground we had covered on public transport, but as Pat and Ron will testify, we covered a fair bit on foot too.
After a couple of days of sightseeing with Leanne and Michael, I was going to phone Anne and say you didn't tell me your daughter was going to bloody well kill us. I couldn't even walk to bed, I had to crawl, but the next morning painkillers saw us all right and we were once again off on our strolls.
This just proves the jocks were there. They're never given recognition for being at this place. It's always Americans. Meantime, they were all down at Checkpoint Charlie. This area was British, and the jocks were there in strength. And like MacArthur said, in the Far East, I will be back, and I have come back. And this is proof of the thing, and it's good to be here.
Ron was quite rightly outraged at the sight of the American flag at the Brandenburg Gate. It is another sign of the developing tourism trade in Berlin, particularly at the gate, where you are charged €1 to have your photo taken with the American flag, or have your passport stamped whilst going through the gate. And as Ron correctly points out, the American flag was never at the gate, as it was the British sector.
Scotland forever. We were included in this creek.
Those green hills of Tyrol, because those green hills are not Highland hills.
This is the barracks and the Tiergarten near the Brandenburg Gates. I was stationed there for a period at the start of the Cold War in case the Russians started any trouble.
The courtyard is of huge historical significance. It was here that Klaus von Stauffenberg was shot by a firing squad as the lead person behind the failed plot to assassinate Hitler in July 1944. This is how the barracks would have looked back when Ron stayed here. Ron's lasting memory of the barracks was the time he got help from a mate to jump the fence to meet a Fräulein. Ron ended up getting his boot caught in the fence, and in the process the Fräulein probably saw everything that was under Ron's kilt as she was waiting on the other side. It remains a secret as to whether it was only the fence that Ron got his leg over that night. The buildings are now used as the headquarters for the German army and a museum for the German resistance movement. Ron and I went inside, but there was no information about when the buildings were used as Ron's barracks. However, a tourist spoke to Ron after overhearing he had served here. The guy said to Ron, "I'd like to thank you for all you did back then." And guess what? He was an American. This statue is a memorial to Stauffenberg and all the other German people who lost their lives in their resistance to the Nazis. Either that, or it commemorates the night Ron jumped the fence to meet his Fräulein. We'll leave you to decide.
The final trip of our visit took us out of the city to another suburb, which is the capital city of the Brandenburg region. In fact, Potsdam has its very own Brandenburg Gate, which actually predates Berlin's, and its many Baroque buildings continue to be restored to their original glory. The most visited landmark in Potsdam is Sanssouci Park, the largest World Heritage Site in Germany. There are no less than 16 palaces, together with countless statues and fountains within the 290 acres of parkland. The Potsdam Conference, the major post-World War II conference between the Allies, took place in one of the palaces within the Sanssouci Park. Potsdam is the British equivalent of Windsor, in that it served as the residence of the Prussian kings and German Kaisers between 1744 and 1918. Whilst not the largest, the Sanssouci Palace is undoubtedly the most ornate and beautiful. This is the entrance to Wittenbergplatz underground train station, which has maintained its original look both inside and out. Many tourists pass through this station, making their way to KaDeWe, Germany's largest department store, which competes with the likes of Harrods of London. These signs outside the station are part of a citywide initiative to mark the various places in Berlin where thousands of people, men, women and children, were transported by the Nazis to concentration camps. This gives a perfect example of where Berlin is just now in dealing with the past. To a certain extent, Berlin has been preoccupied with the enormous changes following the end of the war and then again since German reunification in 1990. Whilst many of the issues surrounding the Nazi era have been dealt with privately, it is only really now, 2 generations on, that some public acknowledgements are being made about the events surrounding that era.
Achtung, Achtung, as they say in Berlin. Please remain seated. There's still a bit to go. That's all of Pat and Ron's holiday in Berlin covered, but we just wanted to do an extra bit as a wee surprise for Ron. Before we get into the serious stuff though, here's a few funny bits. First of all, there should maybe be a wee disclaimer. If you think that everything we covered in this film is 100% true, then maybe you should be aware of the type of people we hang around with.
Before we went over to Berlin, Ron was worried he might bump into a love child from 60 years ago. Lo and behold, look what we found. He was even going to the same place as us, back to Kladau. What do you think? By the way, Pat could get a job in MI5 the way she took this photo without the guy even noticing.
One morning, I was going to go for a jog with Leanne and Michael, and I heard someone cheering behind me, but as I turned round, I realised it was my arse clapping for me. So in disgust, I turned round and decided to make Ron a cup of coffee instead.
So now for the more serious stuff. We were interested in taking Pat and Ron to Berlin as soon as we had spoken to Ron about the time he served there. Although we had been lots of times and read about the history of Berlin, it is really different to speak to someone first-hand about their experience. So we were really excited when Pat and Ron decided to go.
Being there with Pat and Ron lived up to all our expectations. Leanne, being a bit of a history buff, actually had goosebumps when we took Ron to his barracks in Kladow. We were so impressed with the get-up-and-go attitude that Pat and Ron had throughout the week in Berlin. As Pat has already testified, they were pretty knackered each night when we got home.
After a couple of days of sightseeing with Leanne and Michael, I was going to phone Anne and say you didn't tell me your daughter was going to bloody well kill us.
As usual, we had put together a pretty busy itinerary, but Pat and Ron took it in their stride like a pair of Gordon Highlanders. And every morning, they were up for it to take on another day full of gusto.
It really was an honour to show Pat and Ron the city we love and share in Ron's experiences from the past. Pat and Ron arrived in Berlin as our acquaintances, but after all the experiences we shared, they left as our friends.
This really is the end this time, and to see us out is one of Ron's favourite German military marching songs. So finally, this is dedicated to all the marching Pat and Ron did in Berlin.
Auf der Heide blüht ein